Hello and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. My name is Gabriela Güntherroth. I'm a partner at EY and I'm your moderator for this session. So actually you're joining a very unique format. We do have a lot of different sessions throughout the day, touching on different EY insights on key trends. And please feel free to join as many of them as you like, even if you have not registered. So I'm glad you're joining this session where we talk about reshaping results and navigating challenging times. And I have a very distinct expert with me to uncover this exciting topic. Please join me in welcoming Frederik. Hello, Frederik.
Thank you, Gabriela. Very nice having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak about my passion, reshaping results. For almost 20 years now, I'm helping clients to overcome turbulent situations and to initiate performance programs. Has never been boring so far. If I look ahead, it probably won't be, I'm pretty sure. As a partner with EY Parthenon, I'm overseeing our turnaround and performance business. And we are striving to bring the best teams to our clients and to overcome crisis situations and help them tackle those issues together.
Very good, Frederik, and I'm glad we have you here. For the audience online, please feel free to ask any questions during any time during the session. You can use the chat function to submit your questions, and at the end of this session, we will have a Q&A section where we will address your questions. So Frederik, reshaping results and navigating challenging times. This is a very bold and strong title, but could you please elaborate first what reshaping results actually means?
Sure. So as the name already suggests, it's ultimately all about improving financial results. Yet financial results are driven by previous decisions on strategy and operations, for example. We tend to look at this in a phasing model that starts with strategic challenges, such as losing market shares, for example. And if those challenges are not dealt with, earnings will deteriorate over time. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's sooner. But in the end, that could lead to a potentially very critical situation, also with risk on the liquidity side. And therefore, whenever we come into a situation, we first look at the cash position and the cash flow of a company to see if there are any immediate stabilization measures we need to initiate. And only then we start working backwards on other problems on the operational, strategic, you name it, whatever area is relevant in that case.
So it seems that liquidity problems are a clear trigger, but I would assume it's not the only trigger. Can you talk a little bit more of what other triggers could be?
Of course. So when liquidity problems are already present, it's a rather late but not unusual starting point of a reshaping results project. Obviously, there are much earlier points in time that can be any realization of a performance issue, such as decreased profitability, under peer performance of a business area, operational efficiency topics. Can also be transaction driven, that a company wants to optimize its cost position before or after a transaction. So just to name a few examples. What is generally true is the earlier we are called into a situation, the more room to maneuver we have. An important distinction is if the company's management is still in control of the process, or if other stakeholders also have a say. Obviously, this can add a lot of complexity to our work. And I mean, you've mentioned our title, Turbulent Times. That's what we mean by turbulent times. We very often navigate very complicated situations under a lot of time pressure, depending on the liquidity situation, in a very complex landscape with different stakeholders. And that's why it's never boring.
And I guess for you then coming in turbulent times and help the client, you need to have a certain working style to deal with that. I mean, you can't be as turbulent as they are. You have many different stakeholders to deal with. So how you typically approach that?
Yeah, I think speed and decisiveness summarize it quite well. As said before, very often the financial situation demands very swift action. That also means that we cannot analyze each and every detail at the start of the project, but need to rather focus on the bigger topics. Our experience helps us to distinguish the urgent from the necessary, and that is an important distinction. And then whatever measure is deemed to be urgent needs to be implemented right away, not discussed, not planned, but done. And that is, I think, a bit distinct to other projects you currently see in the consulting market. And on top of that, it is extremely important to keep all stakeholders in mind that can be impacted or involved in such a process, and to identify potential risks early on. Because there are many parties that have a say, potentially, and an orchestrated process between owners, clients, suppliers, employees is very essential, because typically people rely on our judgment as an external party to also make their own decisions related to a reshaping results case.
Yeah, and still, if you have this wealth of experience and know how to handle these situations, it's still, I would assume, difficult to orchestrate. And based on your experience, what are some of the key success factors?
I mean, first of all, it's full transparency and honesty. So within, I would say, the core working group between the management and us, we should have and we usually have, very open discussions about identified problems and suggested solutions. I can tell you this is not always pleasant, but crucial. But at the same time, the communication outside of this core group should be very well thought of and planned and also controlled, because sending consistent messages to all stakeholders at the right times is very essential. Otherwise, you can create a lot of chaos that blocks your work. And the other aspect that I want to highlight is we never keep the financial thought of sight. So whatever we discuss or we do ultimately needs to have an impact, ideally a positive impact on P&L, cash flow or balance sheet. And this adds a lot of discipline and objectivity to the process. And it's also a very robust basis for any negotiation with other stakeholders. For example, asking for further financing with banks.
Yeah. And based on what you are saying, I mean, I would assume that many different skill sets are required. So how do you ensure, as EY going into the client, helping in such a situation, that you really have all these different skills around the table?
Indeed, it can be very complex. It needs a very holistic set of different skills. And thankfully, at EY, we have the network of all these various skills. So what usually happens is we have a core team with me or some partner colleagues identifying the core needs of the client. But then very soon, we ask other colleagues from other disciplines onto the table, be it on tax, on legal, on functional, operational topics, you name it, to really bring the best expertise to the clients. And of course, all of this also works at an international scale because we are present in every country. And I can personally say I've spent my previous professional life in smaller organizations. And very often in those cases, we arrived at a point where there were some very technical questions, as just described, around tax, legal, supply chain, IT, where we always had to stop and say, look, this is not our area of expertise. And we need to involve a third party to deal with that. And that, again, adds complexity. So I'm very happy that since being at EY, I can offer all of this within one hand to the client as a package.
Yeah, yeah. And in your title, you write navigating challenging times. I would say we are in the midst of very challenging times. If you take your crystal ball, what holds the future?
I wish I had one, then probably I wouldn't be here. No, but I mean, indeed, we do expect the next years to become very turbulent. If you look at the last decade, it was largely characterized by stable economic growth, relative political stability, and very important for our area of work, very favorable financing conditions. All of that has changed quite drastically in recent periods. And so the businesses of our clients are, of course, heavily impacted by that. And I see much more dynamics on the horizon. So the rhythm of change is becoming faster and faster, and also more complex. If you look at AI and what threat or opportunity, however you want to see that, does that pose to the business models of our clients? In my view, reshaping results used to be more of a one-time effort every now and then in a company's life. Now it has become more of a constant effort that needs to be done to always stay on top of the developments.
Yeah, and you touched on it before, but still I would like to further dig down on it. I mean, also for our audience online, what would be, if you really summarize, some of the key indicators that would trigger the start of a project like Reshaping Results?
I mean, as I said, broadly speaking, it's any decline in performance or any identified need for a performance improvement. That can be a peer comparison if you realize that your company is less profitable than direct competitors are. That can be parts of the company that you realize that in some country the profitability is not as expected. It can be organizationally triggered, that you feel that your operating model, your organization is not up to date anymore with the challenges you have in the market. It's a broad range of topics that can initiate that. Yeah. What is always the same is that we deeply look at financials as the basis of our work, and whatever we do and discuss starts from a financial discussion and comes back into a financial discussion. In between, there might be many more aspects, but that is the important bracket, I would say, is around all of our work.
Yeah, so let's open up for some of the questions that we are receiving online. So actually, one of the first questions I've received and I would like to ask you is, when you go in and you run this type of project, how do you ensure that you achieve sustainable results?
Yes. Well, basically, we always say we come with roll-up sleeves to the client, and that's pretty much true. So whatever we discuss as measures is not in a way that we deliver some nicely brushed PowerPoint paper to the client and leave. It's also nice papers, but we don't stop there. We're really there to implement things together with the client. And I mean, if I look at the distribution of time, usually like 10 to 20% of a case are conceptual work, and the rest is implementation work on site, day-to-day interaction with the client, making sure that everything we've discussed is really implemented. And we also usually implement a governance around that to control implementation effort. Yeah. We call this PTO, Performance Transformation Office. There are many names around, but that's the essence of what we do.
Yeah, and I mean, how from your experience, how is you and your team really navigating this high? I mean, it's often under high time pressure. You have a complex stakeholder landscape. So how do you deal with that, and how do you make it a pleasant client experience?
Well, to be very honest, it's probably not always pleasant, because it sometimes does involve measures such as personal layoffs, closure of sites. So these are not pleasant topics. But I always say they are necessary. And if I've done a good job, I've managed to convince the client that this is necessary, even though it might be unpleasant. And that's the one point. And the other one, you mentioned time pressure. This can also be an advantage, because it really helps to focus discussions and analyses to the essential and to the core. And I've always enjoyed that, because it really helps you to focus on important aspects.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point, because then you're very focused, but on the other hand, you're very focused on reshaping the results. And how do you at the same time guarantee that the company is still working on their actual business?
Indeed, you hit it there on the nail. That is a constant challenge, because usually clients have to manage their day-to-day business. And in case that business deteriorates more, the problem becomes much bigger. So you need to make sure that the core business is still running. And at the same time, you need to spend all these efforts and resources on the project work. And let's face it, it's usually the same core people that are involved. So sometimes clients try to make two teams, Team Blue, Team Red, and say Team Blue focuses on running the day-to-day operations, Team Red focuses on running the project work. That works to a certain degree, but the higher you get, it's the same people who need to do both. And I will be very honest, it's always a stretch to an organization. We can try to mitigate this as much as possible as consultants, but we will never make it away totally.
Yeah, and I mean, I assume that in this complexity, in turbulent times, there might be also resistance from the company when you come in and help them to reshape the results. Not sure if it's always appreciated by everyone in the company. So how do you deal with that and how you can overcome this resistance?
Absolutely right. There is often resistance in various shapes and forms. And quite understandably so, because if it's dramatic changes to, personal working relationships, setups of the company, of course that creates resistance, and that's quite natural. So we always try to really be very much objective and outline the need for the change. And very often people understand after a while. And very often as well, understanding comes from unexpected sides. I've had fantastic relationships with workers' councils in the past because they were convinced at some point that this change was necessary to protect the workspaces for the remaining employees. So that's always the first step, to try to convince on an objective basis. But it's also a leadership question. So it is essential that when we work with a client, the top management and we are aligned on what needs to be done. And then this also needs to be consistently pursued. What happens sometimes, and that is a very dangerous setup, is that some people who are not happy with what's happening and resist find some support at top management level, and then they reopen the discussion. Oh, could we maybe be a bit softer here? Could we make it different there? And if that happens, you've lost traction. So that's why I'm also very adamant in every client discussion that we need to be consistent. Coming back, very open discussions in that small working group. But once a decision has been made there, it needs to be consistently taken to the outside.
And I would assume that management is not always aligned. Did that happen, and how did you solve that?
Of course, even within management teams, there is not always full alignment. Basically, I see this as main part of my job, to create this alignment. It usually works in most cases. Sometimes it doesn't, but then you need to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. But usually, at least the top management is aligned because they do see the need and they also feel the financial pressure.
And I would assume when you go into a company, you start with the reshaping results. There are some quick wins, but there's also some long-term, more sustainable goals. So how would you prioritize that?
Usually it prioritizes itself if you look at it on the timeline. So whenever we identify cost reduction measures, structural improvement measures, a leaner target operating model, the effects by themselves have a certain time horizon. So some things go very fast, others take much longer time and investments. So that gives a sort of a natural order. The discussion we often have is that, if we do that, we maybe cut resources that we might need in the future for some commercial opportunities. So there, you need to have that discussion. But it's not the case so often. So usually there's a natural order, and quick wins are never wrong, in my opinion.
So it's quick wins. And you said before that the beauty of EY is that you can deliver everything out of one hand, but still sometimes you have other parties involved, like financial providers. So how do you deal with these stakeholders?
It's a bit of a chess game sometimes. But the good thing, and coming back to a previous question, whatever we do is reflected in the financial world, P&L, balance sheet, cash flow. And for most rational actors in that stakeholder landscape, that is a very good basis for discussion and decision making. Having said that, not everyone is always acting rationally. That is also part of the truth. But in general, we try to force it into that objective, fact-based financial approach. And that takes out a lot of emotions from discussions usually. And I mean, you have done lots of these projects, you have a wealth of experience. Are there any key success factors or recommendation based on your experience that you would give to companies that have now identified that they have to start with a Reshaping Results project? I mean, number one, I've alluded to that, be very honest to yourself and also in an inner circle on identifying problems. Step two, think about solutions that minimize resistance. So you don't need to always make it the most harsh way you can. There are sometimes more elegant ways to do things. That's the second one. And the third, of course, you're dealing with people. I sometimes say to colleagues, I'm also in parts a psychologist, which is probably true. Think about the dynamics and what interests people have and try to anticipate that. That helps a lot to navigate such a process.
Yeah. Well, Frederik, thank you very much. Very great insights. I think we are convinced that definitely as EY we can help in such a situation. And I think it's also important to highlight that our experience goes cross sectors, so no matter which industry, and also it can affect different size of companies, correct?
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Very insightful. And for our audience online, I would like to highlight the next session, which is starting at 1 o'clock, and will deal with the topic of unlocking the value through AI and how to build trust through cyber transformation. So please feel free to join the session at 1 o'clock, even if you have not registered. This is a very up-to-date topic, an interesting topic. And thank you for joining this session. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you later on during the day in one of the other sessions. So bye for now.